The morning light slipped through the gauzy curtains of the lakeside cottage, illuminating the gentle swirl of steam rising from a kettle on the stove. Elise Carter moved quietly, careful not to wake the silence that hung over the house like a fog. It was just past 6, the sky still a soft, sleepy gray, and the floorboards creaked under her socked feet as she prepared breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast cut diagonally, and chamomile tea, everything just the way Marjorie liked it. Elise had memorized her preferences weeks ago, during the first days of caregiving, when she still believed that attention to detail might lead to appreciation. Now she moved on habit, her hope worn thin from constant dismissal. She placed the teacup gently on its saucer and exhaled, trying to shake the ache that had settled deep in her shoulders. Behind her, the sound of a cane tapping against the floor signaled the start of the daily routine. Marjorie Carter appeared in the doorway, her expression already tight with displeasure, as if simply waking up was cause for irritation. "You're running late," she said flatly, lowering herself into the chair Elise had pulled out moments earlier. Elise offered a soft smile and placed the plate in front of her. "The eggs are still warm," she said gently. Marjorie poked them with her fork, lifted a bite to her lips, and frowned. "Too salty," she muttered. Elise said nothing. There was nothing new to say. She moved to the sink, rinsing the mug she'd used for her own tea earlier, her hands moving on autopilot. Behind her, the clink of cutlery and the occasional disapproving sigh filled the room. On the counter sat a fresh bouquet of peonies, Harper's latest gift. The flowers were delivered yesterday, accompanied by a handwritten card that read, "Thinking of you always, Harper." Elise had been the one to trim the stems, arrange them in a vase, and place them beside Marjorie's favorite window. Harper hadn't shown up in person this time, but that didn't matter. Her name alone was enough to light up Marjorie's face. Elise thought of the last visit, when Harper had stayed for less than half an hour, snapping a few filtered selfies and leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume, and nothing else. Elise leaned against the counter, wrapping her fingers around her cooling mug. Her reflection in the dark kitchen window looked tired. The sweater she wore was pilled, her bun hastily tied, her eyes dulled by weeks of quiet strain. She thought of her library back in Boston, the sun-drenched reading room, the comforting hush of pages turning, the soft murmur of curious minds. It felt like another life. Now, her days were timed by medication alarms and meal times, her nights spent in a cold guest bed that never quite felt like her own. She straightened, took a deep breath, and turned back toward Marjorie, ready to face another day that would likely pass without thanks. Each day at the cottage unfolded with relentless sameness: meals, medications, laundry, repositioning Marjorie in her chair, answering the same questions, repeating the same reassurances. Elise moved through it all with practiced grace, but her energy was slowly draining, like a leaking faucet no one noticed. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, punctuated only by the clatter of dishes or the occasional sharp remark from Marjorie. "You folded the towels wrong again," she said one afternoon, not even looking up from her crossword puzzle. Elise bit the inside of her cheek, correcting the fold without a word. Her life had become a quiet ritual of self-erasure, every task completed with care, every kindness met with indifference or critique. She didn't expect praise, but the absence of even basic acknowledgement was beginning to leave bruises no one could see. She rarely sat down, and when she did, her mind raced with lists, prescriptions to refill, appointments to book, bedding to wash, emails from the university piling up unanswered. Her own life, once full of rhythm and purpose among books and eager students, felt like a fading photograph. In its place was a never-ending role she hadn't auditioned for: caregiver, cook, housekeeper, emotional punching bag. The quiet moments she did steal for herself were interrupted by the ever-present anxiety that she was still somehow not doing enough. Marjorie never missed a chance to compare her to Harper, whose absence had only grown longer while her pedestal remained untouched. Harper would have remembered to pick up the ginger tea, she said with a sigh one evening, as Elise unpacked a bag of groceries. Elise's hands paused mid-motion, but she didn't reply. What was the point? That night, curled up on the guest room bed with a heating pad pressed against her lower back, Elise finally let herself call Noah. His voice, warm but distant, crackled through the speaker. "How are you holding up?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered truthfully, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I don't exist here." There was a pause on the line, then Noah's soft response. "I see you, Liz. I really do." But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. After they hung up, Elise lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached. Her chest felt tight, and despite all the effort she poured into every day, she was starting to feel like a shadow of herself. Needed, but not wanted. Seen, but not valued. And worst of all, she wasn't sure how much longer she could endure it. The front door swung open with a dramatic gust of cold air, and the echo of heels clicking confidently against the hardwood floor. Harper had arrived. Elise glanced up from the kitchen sink as the scent of expensive perfume drifted through the room. Draped in a cashmere coat and designer boots, Harper greeted her mother with a theatrical gasp and a glittering smile. "Oh, Mom! You look amazing! That color really suits you," she chirped, pulling out her phone before Marjorie could even respond. Elise wiped her hands on a dish towel and watched from a distance as Harper posed beside Marjorie's chair, angling the camera just right to catch the morning light streaming in from the window. "Smile, Mom! Let's get one for the gram. #recovery goals," she laughed. Marjorie beamed beside her, her earlier scowl transformed into something almost joyful. "My beautiful girl," she said, the warmth in her voice so different from how she spoke to Elise. Harper stayed just long enough to snap a few curated moments. A selfie with a teacup, a short video of her fluffing Marjorie's pillows, and a carefully posed photo of the bouquet she brought, hydrangeas wrapped in crisp white paper. She didn't stay to prepare tea, didn't ask about Marjorie's medications, didn't even remove her coat. But her charm was magnetic, and Marjorie soaked up every second of it, her expression glowing with admiration. Elise stood silently in the doorway, feeling the weight of her sweatpants and messy bun, suddenly hyper-aware of the bags under her eyes. As Harper floated back toward the door, she gave Elise a fleeting glance, her voice syrupy sweet. "You're doing great, Elise. Honestly, I don't know how you manage." Elise smiled faintly, the compliment feeling more like condescension than gratitude. Moments later, the door shut behind Harper with a soft click, leaving behind the echo of laughter and lavender-scented air. Marjorie sighed happily. "She always brings such positive energy, doesn't she?" Elise didn't answer. She returned to the sink, her hands trembling slightly as she resumed the dishes Harper would never see. The camera might have captured Harper's visit perfectly, but the truth? That Elise was the one who never left, who bore the full weight of Marjorie's care, remained off-screen, unspoken, and unseen. Dinner was simmering on the stove, the scent of rosemary and garlic wafting through the cottage in soft, fragrant waves. Elise stirred the pot with practiced care, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that this meal might meet Marjorie's approval. She'd spent the afternoon chopping, blending, and seasoning with intention, determined to do something right, something worthy. As the stew thickened, she set the table, placing Marjorie's preferred linen napkin to the left, water glass filled just enough to avoid condensation rings on the wood. She even lit a small candle, thinking maybe a little warmth might soften the tension that had been thickening for days. Marjorie entered with her usual slow shuffle and critical gaze. Elise pulled out her chair, then returned to the kitchen to serve the food. Just as she was ladling the stew into bowls, the front door opened. Harper swept in with dramatic flair, her curls bouncing, her phone in hand. "Smells amazing in here," she said brightly, setting a small box of macarons on the counter like a peace offering. Marjorie's face lit up instantly. "Harper, darling, you're just in time for dinner." The three sat down, and for a brief moment, Elise dared to hope. Harper snapped a quick photo of the table before the first bite. Marjorie took a spoonful of the stew, paused, and frowned. "It's a bit bland, don't you think?" she said, turning to Harper, who tasted it and smiled politely. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "But you always did like more salt, Mom." Elise froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. The comment stung more than she expected. "I followed your recipe," she said softly. Marjorie didn't look at her. "Harper just has a better sense for these things. She gets me." Something cracked inside Elise. All the sleepless nights, the aching back, the cancelled work meetings, the quiet tears behind the bathroom door, they surged up at once. "Gets you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Harper stops by once a week, takes a few pictures and leaves. I've been here every single day, doing everything, your meds, your meals, your laundry, and I'm still not enough." Harper raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "This isn't a competition, Elise." "No," Elise snapped, her voice rising. "But if it were, I lost before I ever started." She stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "I have bent over backward trying to earn even a sliver of respect, and it's never come. I'm tired, Marjorie. I'm exhausted from trying to be seen." The room went silent. Marjorie blinked, caught off guard by the sudden eruption. Harper looked down at her phone, pretending not to care. Without another word, Elise turned and walked out of the dining room. Her heart pounded as she reached the guest room, slamming the door behind her. She collapsed onto the bed, her face buried in her hands. The tears came hard and fast, sobs racking her body in a way they hadn't since she first arrived. Outside, the candle on the dinner table flickered against the silence, the smell of untouched stew hanging in the air like a ghost. The next morning the cottage was hushed, but the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it were holding its breath. Elise sat on the edge of the guest bed, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the small suitcase she'd pulled from the closet. It wasn't packed yet, but the decision had already been made. After weeks of self-sacrifice, of aching for recognition that never came, of silently swallowing hurt, Elise had reached her limit. The night before had broken something inside her, but in the sharpness of that pain, she'd found a strange kind of clarity. She had tried, truly. She had poured every ounce of herself into caring for Marjorie, not out of obligation, but out of hope. Hope that kindness would be seen, that effort would eventually be enough. But now she saw it clearly. No amount of devotion could earn someone's love if they refused to give it. With slow, deliberate movements, she began folding her clothes. Sweaters, socks, the flannel pajama set she'd barely had time to rest in. Each item felt like a small reclaiming of herself. She moved with a calm she hadn't felt in weeks, like a woman walking out of a burning building. When she stepped into the kitchen, the morning light was soft, filtering over the bouquet of Harper's hydrangeas, now beginning to wilt. Marjorie sat at the table, silent, her face unreadable. Elise said nothing. She simply placed a folded note on the counter and walked to the front door. Outside, the air was cold and crisp, the lake still as glass. Elise paused for a moment, breathing in deeply. She dialed Harper's number. When the call picked up, Harper's voice was impatient. "What is it, Elise? I'm busy." "I'm leaving," Elise said firmly. "I've packed my things. Marjorie needs someone here, so it's your turn now." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then, "You can't just drop this on me." "I already did," Elise replied, her voice steady. "I've done my part." Before Harper could protest further, Elise ended the call. She stood there a moment longer, the phone still in her hand, then slipped it into her coat pocket. With one final glance at the cottage, at all it had taken from her, she picked up her suitcase and walked away, not with regret, but with the quiet strength of someone who had finally chosen herself. At first, Marjorie barely noticed the silence. She told herself Elise was just out on an errand or taking some time to cool off from their little disagreement. But by the second evening, when no dinner appeared on the table and no gentle reminder came about her pain medication, the silence began to gnaw at her. The house, once filled with quiet but constant movement, Elise's footsteps, the soft clatter of dishes, the rustle of pages turning in the guest room, was now hollow. The air felt colder. Her tea was lukewarm. Her meals, if she managed to assemble them at all, were bland or skipped altogether. For the first time since her fall, Marjorie realized just how much Elise had done. Not just the visible tasks, but the invisible ones. The anticipating, the adjusting, the enduring. By the fourth day it was more than an inconvenience, it was loneliness. The days stretched long, each hour louder in its emptiness. Harper hadn't come. She hadn't even called, except for a single text that read, "Sorry, crazy week, maybe this weekend." Marjorie reread it 3 times, each one more bitter than the last. She tried to do things herself, get to the kitchen, heat up soup, but the stairs took too long, the cupboards were too high, and the loneliness clung to her like a second skin. The silence forced her to reflect. She thought of Elise's careful attentiveness, her calm presence, her quiet grace under pressure. Elise, who never raised her voice no matter how sharp the words flung at her. Elise, who had folded every towel just right, brewed tea without being asked, and stayed long past the point anyone else would have walked away. For so long Marjorie had chosen not to see those things, had chosen instead to place Harper on a pedestal, simply because it was easier. Harper brought light, sure, but only in flashes. Elise had brought care, and patience, and consistency, and Marjorie had driven her away. That evening, sitting alone by the dim glow of the fireplace, Marjorie picked up her phone with trembling hands and called Elise. When the call connected and Elise answered with a quiet, cautious, "Hello?" Marjorie's voice broke on the first word. "Clara, I need to talk to you." There was a long pause, and then Elise replied gently, "I'm listening." Marjorie's voice wavered with something Elise had never heard from her before: fear. "She hasn't come, Harper, she hasn't been back. I thought she would, but she's too busy, and I can't manage this house alone. I didn't think it would be like this." Elise said nothing, letting the weight of Marjorie's admission settle. "I'm sorry," Marjorie whispered, the words falling like stones. "I thought I knew who cared. I was wrong." For the first time, Elise heard it, not just regret, but realization. The beginning of something honest, something overdue, and though her heart was still sore, part of her softened. Marjorie at last had opened the door. 2 days passed before Marjorie called again, this time not to ask for help but simply to speak. Elise hesitated before answering, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure if she was ready to reopen a wound that had just begun to close. But when she picked up, the voice that met her wasn't sharp or demanding. It was trembling, almost unfamiliar. "Elise?" Marjorie began, her breath shaky. "I need to say something I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. "I was cruel to you," Marjorie continued, her voice cracking. "You gave me everything, your time, your energy, your kindness, and I treated it like nothing. I let my pride and my blind love for Harper make me blind to what was right in front of me." Elise sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding. She had imagined this moment more than once, but it had always felt like a fantasy, something people hoped for but never received. Hearing the apology now, unforced and unrehearsed, stirred something deep within her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." "I don't expect forgiveness," Marjorie said quickly. "I just needed you to know. I've been sitting here thinking about every time I brushed you off, every moment I made you feel invisible. And now that you're gone, I finally see what I lost." There was a long pause. Elise felt tears forming, not out of pain this time, but from the release of something she'd carried far too long. "I don't know what the next step is," she said honestly. "But I appreciate you saying it. I really do." "It's a start," Marjorie replied quietly. "I want to do better. If you'll let me." For the first time, there was no resentment between them, just two women, broken in different ways, trying to piece together something fragile and real. Elise didn't know what the future would look like, but in that moment she allowed herself a sliver of hope. Healing didn't have to happen all at once. Sometimes it began with a single word, sorry. And for the first time, it felt like they were finally speaking the same language. 2 weeks later, Elise returned to the cottage, not as a caregiver, not out of obligation, but by choice. This time it was different. She didn't arrive with a packed suitcase or a binder full of medications. She came for a short visit, unsure of what she'd find. As she stepped inside, she half expected the familiar chill of Marjorie's silence or the sharp commentary that had once met her at every turn. But, instead, she was greeted by a faint scent of vanilla and the quiet hum of soft jazz playing in the background. Marjorie sat in her usual armchair by the window, a crocheted blanket over her lap and a cup of tea in hand. "Elise," she said softly, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm glad you came." Elise set down her coat and approached slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't plan to stay long," she said honestly. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." Marjorie nodded, her eyes misty. "Better now." She motioned to the empty armchair across from her. "Sit." "I made tea." Elise hesitated, then took the seat. The warmth of the cup in her hands was oddly grounding. For a while they sat in silence, comfortable this time, not tense. Then Marjorie spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I started keeping a list of the things you used to do that I never thanked you for. It's long. Turns out, I was a much harder person to care for than I wanted to admit." Elise smiled faintly, her fingers curling around the ceramic mug. "It wasn't easy, but I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I cared. And I didn't know how to accept that," Marjorie said. "But I'm learning." Over the next hour, they talked, really talked. No veiled jabs, no passive-aggressive sighs. Marjorie asked Elise about her work, about the library, about Noah. She even remembered Elise's favorite tea and offered her a small tin to take home. It wasn't grand, but it was something, a gesture, a step. They laughed quietly over memories of botched dinners and shared frustrations about Harper's latest too busy excuse. It was the first time Elise had seen Marjorie as a woman, not just a difficult mother-in-law, but someone flawed, aging, trying. And for Marjorie, it was the first time she truly saw Elise as her equal, not an outsider. When Elise rose to leave, Marjorie stood too, steadying herself with her cane. "Thank you for giving me another chance," she said. "You didn't have to." Elise looked at her, this time not with resentment, but with something gentler. "I didn't come back to pick up where we left off. I came because I believe people can grow." Marjorie nodded. "Then I'll keep trying to prove that I can." They embraced, briefly, awkwardly, but it was real, and in that small moment of connection, something quietly beautiful had begun to take root. The city air felt lighter than Elise remembered. As she stepped into her apartment, the soft clink of her keys in the bowl by the door felt like a homecoming. The scent of cinnamon from Noah's diffuser lingered in the hallway, and the familiar stacks of books on the coffee table made her chest ache in the best way. It had been over a month since she'd left the cottage, and though she had returned once to see Marjorie, this, being home, felt like the first true moment she'd allowed herself to exhale. Noah emerged from the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and flour dusting his shirt, and when he saw her, he smiled in that quiet, knowing way he always had. "Welcome back," he said simply, and Elise walked into his arms like a tide returning to shore. That evening, as rain pattered gently against the window, Elise curled up on their couch, sipping tea from her favorite chipped mug. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from Marjorie. Just a photo. A single pink tulip in full bloom in the planter box Elise had built by the kitchen window before she left. Beneath the photo, a message. "Still blooming, like you." Elise stared at it, a lump rising in her throat. There had been no grand reconciliation, no dramatic declarations, just small, steady gestures. A phone call here, a letter there, an apology repeated with more sincerity each time. Marjorie had started mailing her recipes, even included a handwritten note once that said, "I hope these bring you warmth like you brought me." It wasn't about erasing what had happened, it was about rebuilding from the cracks. Elise reached for her library ID, the one she'd tucked away weeks ago. She pinned it back onto the corkboard above her desk. It felt right. She had spent so long pouring herself into someone else's needs, trying to be enough, to earn a place she was never meant to fight for, but now she was reclaiming her space, not just in her home or her work, but in her own heart. She wasn't the shadow in the background anymore. She was the woman who stood her ground, who chose herself, and who forgave, not because it was asked of her, but because it freed her. She leaned into Noah's shoulder as the rain continued, the warmth of his presence steady beside her. There were still moments of ache, still echoes of things left unsaid, but she felt whole, seen, respected. She had walked through pain and come out the other side, not bitter, but braver. And that, she realized, was the kind of pride no one could take away. The story of Elise Carter is a quiet, powerful reminder that self-worth doesn't come from being needed, it comes from being respected. Elise gave everything she had to care for someone who refused to acknowledge her value, hoping that love, patience, and sacrifice would eventually be enough. But the lesson she learned, and the one we take from her journey, is that sometimes walking away is the most courageous act of all. We often believe that loyalty means staying, even when we're hurt. But Elise shows us that boundaries are not abandonment. They're protection. She didn't stop caring, she simply stopped allowing herself to be diminished. And in doing so, she gave others the space to reflect and change. True healing in relationships doesn't begin with obligation. It begins with accountability, humility, and the willingness to grow. Through Marjorie's eventual apology and Elise's brave return, not as a servant but as an equal, we learn that reconciliation is possible, but only when it's built on mutual respect. In the end, Elise found peace not because she was finally seen, but because she finally saw herself clearly. And that's a lesson worth carrying. You are already enough, even when others can't see it yet.